Her own brother beat her, sold her hair, then sold her. A crippled cowboy bought her freedom. The left boot goes on before the right, always, not because of habit, though it is habit by now, but because the right leg doesn't bend the way it used to, and if I put that boot on first, I spend the next 10 minutes getting red in the face trying to haul the left one up without tipping off the cot. I learned that the third morning after I could stand again. Took me 3 years to stand again. So the left boot goes on first, and that's just the way it is. It was a Tuesday in October when I first saw her. I know it was Tuesday because Halton ran his livestock sale on Tuesdays, and I was there to look at a gray quarter horse I had no real business buying, my funds being what they were. $43 and some change, and a reputation for being the man who used to rope calves faster than any hand in the Cimarron Basin. Back when my hip was made of bone, and not whatever it is now, calcium fused wrong, the doctor said, like he was describing a bad weld on a fence gate. The auction yard smelled like it always did. Manure and dust and the particular sweet rot of old wood warped by too many dry summers. There were maybe 60 men standing around the pen, hats pulled low, not looking at each other the way men don't when they're sizing up an animal they want and don't want the next man to know it. I was leaning on the top rail with my weight on my good side, watching the gray horse, when Harlan Pruitt came through the gate on the far end leading something that wasn't a horse. I want to tell you what I saw clearly, but I'm not sure I can because what I saw and what I understood took a moment to come together. There was a young woman, 20, maybe 21, hard to say. Her face had the kind of thinness that comes from not enough eating for long enough that it starts to look permanent. She was wearing a dress that had been good once, calico, blue and white, but it had been washed so many times it was the color of sky in January. Her hands were bound at the wrists with rope. Not tight, not cruel, the way you'd bind something you didn't want to run and didn't expect to run, because running had been trained out of it. Her hair was gone, not cut short. Gone, shaved close to the skull on the right side, hacked down to an inch on the left, uneven and rough, the way it looks when someone took shears to it the way you'd shear a sheep, quick and without interest. I looked at Harlan Pruitt. I'd known Harlan Pruitt 8 years. He was a man who smelled of bay rum and whose word was worth the paper it wasn't written on. He was smiling at the assembled men the way he smiled when he had something he thought was clever. "Gentlemen," he said. He always called them gentlemen. It was the only polite word he owned. "I got a situation here that needs resolution. Girl needs a keeper. Brother needs operating capital. This is commerce." I didn't move. I was watching her face. She was looking at the ground. Not at her feet, at the ground, a foot in front of her feet, the way you look when you've decided that whatever is happening is not something you can stop, and the only thing you can do is be somewhere else in your mind while your body goes through with it. I said, "Harlan." He looked at me. Men around me shifted. A couple of them knew my name, most of them just registered the voice. "What's her debt?" I said. "Ain't debt," Harlan said. "It's a sale. Brother's got paper on her guardianship since the father died. Legitimate." I looked at the rope on her wrists. I looked at her shorn head. I thought about the word legitimate for a moment, and decided it was the second worst word in the English language, after the name of the man who'd put that rope on her. "What's the price?" I said. Harlan looked at me the way a man looks at a one-legged dog that's barking. "Caleb Rourke," he said, "you got money now." "I've got a question," I said. "What's the price?" He told me. It was $38, which was the price of her hair. He'd sold the hair to a wig maker in Dodge the week prior. He mentioned this as though it was information that would be useful to me, plus a $2 finder's fee for Harlan himself, which was the kind of arithmetic Harlan Pruitt had been doing his whole life, and would do until someone eventually stopped him. $40. I had 43 and change. I pushed off the fence rail and walked to him, which took me a moment because the ground was uneven, and I had to watch where I put my right foot or the hip catches and I go down. I've gone down in front of men before. I've gotten back up in front of men before. Neither thing bothers me much anymore. I walked to Harlan Pruitt and I gave him $40 and I took the rope off her wrists myself because he showed no sign of doing it, and I put the rope on the ground and I said to her quietly, "I'm Caleb Rourke. I've got a camp about 2 miles east. You don't have to come, but if you want to, you're welcome to it." She looked up at me then for the first time. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage in dry weather, and they were full of something I recognized, not fear exactly, the aftermath of fear, the way a country looks after a bad storm has moved through. scoured. She said nothing. She walked through the gate ahead of me and waited on the far side of it. I collected my hat, which I'd set on the fence post, and I did not buy the gray quarter horse, and I walked out of Harlan Prewitt's auction yard on a Tuesday in October with $43 minus $40 minus 38 cents for the licorice I'd bought from the boy at the gate, which left me with $2.62, and a woman walking 3 paces ahead of me who I did not know, and whose name I did not yet know, and whose brother, somewhere in some town, spending his operating capital on whatever men like that spend it on, had sold her hair, and then sold her, in that order, like she was a thing to be stripped, and then disposed of. Her name was Nora Vass. She told me that first evening, sitting near enough to the fire to be warm but far enough for me to have room, eating beans I'd made, which were not good beans. I cook about as well as I rope calves these days, which is to say barely, but she ate them without complaint, and when she was done she set the tin down and she said, "My name is Nora Vass. My brother's name is Edmund Vass, and I would appreciate it if you never said it to me again." I said I wouldn't. She said, "You paid $40. I said I did. She looked at the fire and she said, "That's nearly everything you had." I didn't ask how she knew that. I didn't ask how she knew anything. Women who have been through what she'd been through develop a way of reading a man's situation, the way a good tracker reads ground, not because they want to, but because it keeps them alive. "It is," I said. She was quiet a moment, then she said, "Why?" I thought about that. Not the honest answer, I knew the honest answer, but how to say it without it sounding like something it wasn't. Like I expected something back. Like I'd bought myself something instead of buying her out of something. I said, "I've been in a situation before where I needed someone to make a decision in my favor and nobody did. I had the money." She looked at me then, a long look, the kind that takes stock. "Your leg," she said. "Hip," I said, 3 years ago. "Horse came down on me wrong." She nodded, like that explained something it probably did explain. We didn't talk much more that night. She took the bedroll I gave her and she slept on the far side of the fire, and I sat up a while listening to the plane. Wind in the grass, the fire settling. A coyote somewhere northeast, not close. I thought about Edmund Vass and what I'd like to say to Edmund Vass, and then I stopped thinking about it, because thinking about men like that is like staring into the sun. It doesn't help and it damages you. I want to try to explain the next part clearly, because people who haven't been through a long recovery, a real one, the kind that takes years and leaves marks, don't always understand what it does to a man. What it took from me wasn't just the speed. Wasn't just the roping or the riding or the work I used to be able to do in a day. What it took was the thing underneath those things. The sense that my body was mine, that I could put it somewhere and trust it to stay, that I could walk across a yard and it would be just walking, nothing to think about, nothing to manage. I was 39 years old and I walked like a man of 60, and I had not been with a woman in 3 years, and I had not, in those 3 years, allowed myself to want anything that required me to be whole, because wanting things when you're broken is just a way of proving to yourself how broken you are. I'd gotten careful, small. I lived in a 16-foot camp on land I leased, not owned. I had a fire and a cot and a horse that was old but honest. I had enough, I told myself. I told myself that often enough that I'd started to believe it. Nora Vass stayed. I want to be honest about what that looked like in the early days, because it wasn't what you'd think and I don't want to dress it up. She stayed because she had nowhere to go and no money and no hair and no brother who was going to help her and no knowledge of the territory. She stayed the way a person stays when all the doors are shut. I understood that. I did not expect anything different. I gave her the tent, such as it was, and I slept outside under the cart tarp. And I did not crowd her and I did not ask for anything, and I did not explain myself or my reasoning any more than I already had. What I did was work. Jed Marbury 3 miles up the draw needed fence repaired. I could do fence. Slow, but I could do it. I could sink posts one-handed if I had to. I'd learned how, the way you learn everything after an injury, which is badly and then adequately and then well enough. I repaired Marbury's fence over 4 days, and he paid me $6 and the use of a milk cow for a month, which was more useful to me right then than the money because Nora was thin in a way that needed more than beans. She milked the cow without being asked. First morning I came back from the creek and there she was, sitting on her heels behind the old roan cow, working steady and quiet. She did not look up when I came in. She just kept working, her hands sure, the milk coming in a thin, steady stream into the bucket. I said, "You know cows." She said, "I know work." There was something in the way she said it, not bitter, past bitter. Work was the one thing in her life that had always been hers and nobody could sell. I went and made the fire. We divided the days without ever discussing it. She did what needed doing inside the camp, the cooking, which got better than mine fast, the mending of things I'd let go unmended, the keeping of the small order that makes a camp livable. I did the outside work, the labor for hire, the animals, the wood. It wasn't a plan. It was just two people finding the shape of what was needed and fitting into it. Like water finding the level of a slope. Nobody decides, it just settles. She asked me about the hip one afternoon about 2 weeks in. We were sitting on the tongue of the cart eating lunch. Bread she'd made, which was the best bread I'd had in 3 years. And I told her so, and she looked at me like I'd said something strange. Like compliments were a foreign language she was still learning the grammar of. "The horse came down on you," she said. "Came down on me?" I said. "River crossing. Flash flood, the water came up fast, and he spooked and went over sideways, and I was under him in about 4 feet of moving water for I don't know how long. Long enough." "Who pulled you out?" "Ramon Delgado, worked the same outfit, good man." "Where is he now?" "Gone north, his family's up in Wyoming." She was quiet a moment eating. "Who looked after you?" "Ranch kept me on 3 months," I said. "Figured I'd mend and be useful again. When it was clear I wouldn't mend the way they needed, they let me go." She looked at me with those gray-green eyes, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "That's a cold thing." "That's the work," I said. "Can't run cattle with a man who can't run." She shook her head just slightly. "Still cold." I didn't disagree. The weeks settled into cold. End of October, then November, the plains turning the color of old paper, the grass lying down flat in the morning under frost that didn't lift until midday. I was working for Marbury still, mending things, fixing a leaking water tank, and I picked up a few days' work with the Oglesby brothers who were bringing in a late cutting of hay. I couldn't throw bales the way I used to, but I could drive a wagon and call out to the stackers, and nobody was going to fire a driver who showed up sober and on time, which put me in a small minority among the available men. The money was thin. It was always thin, but there was enough. There was more than there'd been when it was just me, which I hadn't expected. I'd expected a woman in my camp to be an additional cost, and there was some of that, but there was also the milk and the bread and the mending and the work she picked up at the Oglesby place cooking for their crew during hay season. She came back from that with $4 and a ham, and she set both on the camp table like they were ordinary things, which they were and they weren't. I said, "You didn't have to work for them." She said, "I'm aware of that." She said it without heat, just stating the nature of her own decisions. The hair was growing back. Not fast, hair doesn't come back fast, but there was a softness at her temples now, a dark down that caught the light. She never talked about it. I never talked about it. There are things you don't talk about because talking about them doesn't help and leaving them alone does. One night in November, cold coming hard, I was working on my boot by the fire, the right one, the seam going at the heel. And she was sewing something across from me, and she said, without looking up, "Edmund sold the hair first because he needed money quickly." I kept working on the boot. "He'd done it before," she said. "To the woman my father hired after our mother died, took her braid while she was sleeping, said it was in lieu of wages." She looked at the sewing in her hands. "My father let him." I thought about the kind of man who raises a son like that. I thought about a lot of things, and I stitched the heel of my boot, and I said, "Where's your father now?" "Dead," she said. 3 years ago. Edmund got the farm and I got Edmund, legally speaking, which is a thing I think should be illegal but apparently isn't." "It probably will be someday," I said. "Probably," she said. "Long time from now." She went back to her sewing. I went back to my boot. The fire moved between us and the wind outside moved against the canvas. And it was the most ordinary evening, the most ordinary night. And I was aware of it the way you're aware of something good that you can't quite look at directly out of the corner of your eye, because you don't want to examine it too hard and find out it's fragile. I want to tell you about the night in December. There was a man named Cole Pritchard who worked the saloon in Beaumont, which was the nearest town of size. He did work for the saloon, but also for anyone who'd pay him, and what he did was remind people of debts. Remind them physically if they were the kind of people who needed that kind of reminder. He came to my camp on a Thursday night late after dark, which is how men like that prefer to arrive, when the world is small and the noise is down. I heard him before I saw him, the horse on the frozen ground, and I was already standing when he came into the firelight. He was a big man. I will say that plainly because it's the truth. 6 feet and change, wide through the shoulders, and he had the particular stillness of a man who's been in enough situations that he doesn't use his body as a threat because he doesn't need to. The fact of him is enough. He looked at me, and he looked past me to where Nora had come to the tent flap. He said, "Edmund Vass sends his regards." I said, "Edmund Vass can keep his regards." Pritchard looked at me the way men look at things they've already decided about. "The girl's still legally his ward. He wants her back. He said he'd pay you what you paid per wit." "He sold her," I said. "He's repurchasing," Pritchard said. "That's his word." "His word," I said. "All right." I shifted my weight, getting my feet right. I'm slow. I know I'm slow. I also know that slow doesn't mean stopped, and that men who look at a cripple and see a thing already defeated make a mistake that is sometimes expensive. "You tell Edmund Vass that she's free. She's been free since I cut that rope. And if he has a legal argument to make, he can make it to a judge, and I'll stand in front of that judge and say what I saw at Harlan Prewitt's yard on a Tuesday in October, and we'll see how that particular story lands." Pritchard was quiet. "I'll also say," I said, "that I've got a rifle in that cart that was my father's and I can still shoot. Not fast, but I don't need fast. I'm not going anywhere." The fire between us, him on his horse in the dark, me standing on the bad side of the fire so he couldn't see the limp, which was a calculation I'd made when I heard him coming and which I'm not ashamed of. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked past me again at Nora, and she was standing in the tent flap with her arms crossed and her chin up, and the look on her face was not the look I'd seen in Harlan Prewitt's yard. That look had been gone. What was there now was something different. She was standing in her own place looking at a man who had come to take something that was hers, meaning herself, and she was not looking at the ground. Pritchard turned his horse and rode. I don't know what he said to Edmund Vass. I never heard from Edmund Vass again. Either the judge argument put him off, or the rifle, or something else entirely. Maybe he'd already found another way to get his operating capital and had moved on. Men like that move on. The world keeps providing them with new situations to exploit. I stood by the fire until I couldn't hear the horse anymore. Behind me, Nora said, "You all right?" "Fine," I said. "Your hands are shaking," she said. I looked at my hands. They were some not bad. "They do that," I said, "cold." She came and stood beside me. Not close, not touching, just beside me, looking out into the dark where Pritchard had gone, the same direction, standing her ground on it. After a while she said, "He won't come back." "No," I said. "How do you know?" "Because men like that," I said, "are gamblers. They go where the odds favor them. The odds here don't favor him anymore." I paused. "The odds here don't favor anyone who comes thinking I'm a soft mark." She looked at me. In the firelight, her face was serious and steady, and the hair was long enough now to move a little in the wind, still short, still growing back, but hers. And she'd stopped covering it with a kerchief 3 weeks ago, just let it be what it was, and that had told me something about her. She said, "No, I don't suppose they do. There's a particular thing that happens in winter on the plains that people who have never lived through it don't quite believe. The cold gets absolute, not cold as in uncomfortable. Cold as in the world contracts to the radius of your fire. You wake up in the night and every breath is a small white cloud, and the canvas is rigid, and the water in the bucket has a skin of ice, and it is December and January and February, and those months are a different country from the rest of the year. I have always been all right in cold. My hands stiffen some, and the hip is worse in cold, stiffer, slower. The deep ache that lives in the bone redoubles, but I've learned to work with it. You keep moving. You don't let yourself sit still for too long. You move even when it's painful because the alternative is stiffening solid and then you're no good to anyone. We got through December on Marbury's fence money and what was left of the hay work and a piece of good fortune in the form of a man named Galt, Franklin Galt, who owned about 12,000 acres east of Beaumont and was building a new line cabin and needed someone to run a team of oxen for the grading work. He looked at my hip and he looked at my hands and he said, "Can you drive a team?" I said I could. He said, "That's a big ask in December." I said I'd been driving teams since I was 9 years old, and cold didn't change what you know. He hired me for 3 weeks and paid me $11.50, which was the most I'd made in a month since before the accident. And I came home from that work on the last Friday with the money in my coat pocket, and my face raw and the hip singing its usual December song. And Nora had a fire going and something on the stove that smelled like nothing I could name specifically, except that it smelled like warmth made into food. I sat down at the camp table, and she set a plate in front of me, and I looked at the food, and I said, "What is this?" She said, "Venison stew. The Oglesby boy brought a haunch. I gave him bread for it." "You made bread." "I make bread most days," she said, sitting down across from me. "Have you not noticed?" I had noticed. I just never said it, because saying it made it feel like something I might be about to lose. I ate the stew. It was the best thing I'd eaten in, I don't know, years. There was something in it besides the meat, some herb she'd found or traded for, something green and sharp that cut through the heaviness of the venison and made the whole thing clean and alive. I ate all of it, and then I sat back and I looked at the fire and I said, "Nora, I've got $11.50 here from the Galt job." She looked at me. "I want to talk to you about something," I said. She waited. "I've been leasing this land," I said. 16 acres off Totham Creek. The man who owns it, Hendricks, you haven't met him. He's been making noises about selling. The whole section, which is 160 acres. He wants $320 for it, which is $2 an acre, which is fair for this ground. Maybe less than fair. I stopped. "What I'm saying is, if I work Galt's crew through the spring when the real building starts, and I do the Marbury fencing, and you keep on with the Oglesby cookwork, if we're careful, we could have that money by summer." She hadn't looked away from me. "I'm not asking you to stay because of the money," I said. "I'm asking because I'm asking if you want to stay, on those terms, on real terms." I looked at my hands on the table, the knuckles rough and the skin split at the forefinger from the cold. "I know what you went through. I know where you were when I met you. I'm not pretending that what I'm describing is the same as what you might have had if your life had gone different. But it's a piece of ground, a real piece. Your name on it same as mine if you want it that way, and I run a straight house. You know that by now." Nora Vass put her hand over mine on the table. Just laid it there, flat and warm, on top of my cold, cracked hand, and she left it there. She said, "Caleb." I looked at her. She said, "I've been meaning to say something to you for about a month now, and I haven't because I couldn't find the words that weren't too much or too little." She looked at the table between us, then back up. "You looked at me in that yard and you saw a person. Not a situation, not a problem, not a thing to be managed. A person." Her voice was even plain. "I have been a situation my whole life. I was my father's situation, and then Edmund's situation, and then Harlan Prewitt's situation. You looked at me and you saw a person." Her hand pressed down slightly on mine. "So when you ask me if I want to stay, yes, not because of the land or the money or because I've got nowhere else, because this is where I want to be, here, with you." The fire in the stove ticked, wind on the canvas. The plane outside going on in every direction the way it does, indifferent, enormous. I turned my hand over under hers and held it. We sat like that a while, no need to say more than had been said. Some things you say once and they're enough, and anything after that is just noise. I want to tell you how the spring went, because it matters to the shape of things. Galt's building project expanded. He was a man who'd gotten somewhere by always doing more than the thing he'd originally planned. And the crew grew, and the work went longer and harder than expected. And I drove the team 6 days a week from March through May. And Nora cooked for Galt's crew 4 days a week in addition to everything else. And we were both tired in the way that good hard work makes you tired, which is different from the tiredness of bad circumstances. It goes to the bone, but it doesn't hollow you. Marbury's full fence run, the Oglesby brothers' spring planting work. A piece of work for a homesteader named Pratt who needed his barn refooted before the summer wait, which I'd never done alone, but figured out from the principle of the thing, which is how you figure out most things you need to do. We bought the land from Hendricks in August. $320. I put it on his table in cash, 32 $10 bills, which represented about 7 months of every dollar we made that didn't go to food or supplies, and Hendricks counted it and then looked at me and said, "Caleb Rourke, I heard you were finished." "Heard wrong," I said. He signed the paper. I want to be precise about what it meant to hold that paper. You can talk about ownership in the abstract. A deed is a piece of paper. Land is dirt and grass. None of it is as solid as it sounds, but standing in Hendrix's front room holding a piece of paper that said 160 acres was mine and Nora's, with the bad hip and the slow walk and the $43 I'd started with not quite a year before, it wasn't triumph. It wasn't like the stories make it sound. It was quieter than that. It was like something I'd been holding my breath against finally resolved. And I could breathe the way you breathe when there's real air, and not just the thing you've been managing on. Nora was outside with the horses. I came out and I handed her the paper and she read it. She was a good reader, better than me. Her mother had schooled her. And when she looked up, her eyes were wet, which was the only time I ever saw that from her, the only time in all of it. She folded the paper carefully. She put it in the breast pocket of her coat against her chest. She said, "Let's go home." The hair had grown back by then. Not the same length it had been, not yet. It was at her shoulders dark, with a slight wave in it that she kept back with a piece of cord. She looked like herself. She looked like the self she'd been working toward this whole time, the one that had been there in Harlan Prewitt's yard under the shorn skull and the scoured eyes, waiting for enough time and space to come out. The first winter on our own land. I want to describe the house as it was, because it wasn't much. It was what I'd built through the fall, not from new lumber. I couldn't afford new lumber, but from the salvage of Hendrix's old line cabin that he'd let me take down and use, and some timber from a stand of cottonwood on the creek, and 2 weeks of work that left me so tired at the end of each day that I was asleep before my back hit the cot. It was square, it was solid. It had 2 windows, glass in both, which I'd traded 3 days' fence work for, and a plank floor and a stove that drew right, which is not always a given with a stove built from salvage. It was not a big house. It was a right-sized house, which is different. Nora had put a rag rug on the floor that she'd made from scraps. She'd put a shelf up over the window on the south side, just a plank shelf, and on it she kept a tin cup and a small crockery jar and a thing I hadn't noticed until one evening in November, a smooth gray stone, oval, the size of a man's palm, dark gray and river-worn. I asked her about it. She said, "I found it on the creek bank the first week we were here. I kept it because it felt like something that had been in that creek for a long time and been made better by it." I looked at the stone. I looked at her. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything I could say that the stone hadn't already said. December. The first real snow. The kind that comes in the night and changes the world so that when you open the door in the morning the plain is white and still, and the light is different. Thinner, cleaner, everything slowed down. I was outside breaking the ice on the water trough, the axe handle cold through my gloves, when Nora came out with 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one and stood beside me looking at the plain, white and empty all the way to the horizon. She put her hand on my back, just her hand between my shoulder blades, solid and warm. I stood there with the coffee and the cold air and the white plain and her hand on my back, and I thought about the man I'd been 3 years before, lying in a ranch bunkhouse with a broken hip, and no one bringing him coffee, no one standing beside him. The men he'd worked with going about their days, and the days not having any particular shape to them because there was nothing in them that was his, nothing that would miss him if he wasn't in it. I thought about Harlan Prewitt's yard, a Tuesday in October, the rope on her wrists, the way she looked at the ground. I thought about what $40 had bought, which was not a woman, which was never a woman, which was the small crack in a bad situation that was big enough to let light through. And then, not because of the money, not because of the deed, but because of the months between, the way 2 people find the shape of what's needed and fit into it, the level of the slope, this. Her hand on my back. The white plain. The coffee getting warm in my cold hands. "You're thinking," she said. "Some," I said. She didn't ask what about. She knew what about. We'd learned each other that well, which is the kind of learning that happens when you live close to a person and pay attention, and the person is worth paying attention to. I put my arm around her, there in the snow, at the trough, at the edge of our land, and she leaned into me, not heavily, not like she needed to be held up, but the way you lean into something solid that you have chosen to lean into, that you could stand away from and don't. The plane went out in every direction, white and wide in hours. I still put the left boot on first. Every morning. The right leg doesn't bend the way it used to, and it never will. I have learned everything I know about patience from that fact, that some things don't go back, they just go forward in the new shape, and the shape is workable if you're willing to work it. What I have now is this, 160 acres on Totem Creek, a house with 2 glass windows and a plank floor. A woman who came out of a bad situation and chose, when she had choices again, to choose this, to choose me, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That's not a small thing. In fact, I think it might be the largest thing. Nora is inside right now. I can smell bread through the door, which she makes most mornings, and which I never stopped being grateful for, and she knows I'm grateful and doesn't need me to keep saying it. She knows. That's the thing about a person who's been watching for what's real their whole life, she knows. Last Tuesday, Franklin Galt came out to look at the creek land, thinking about some irrigation work he might want to discuss, and he walked the property with me for about an hour, and when we were done he said, "You've done something real here, Rourke." I thought about how to answer that. I said had help. He looked at the house, at Nora, who had come to the door when she heard the horses, standing in the doorway in her coat, the dark hair at her shoulders, the stone-colored eyes that didn't miss much. Galt said, "That's the woman wasn't she the one from Prewitt's yard?" I said, "She is." He nodded. He looked at her the way men look at something they've categorized wrong and are recategorizing. "Heard Prewitt's story," he said. "Heard you paid your last $1. 40 of them," I said. "Best $40 ever spent in this county, I reckon." I looked at her in the doorway. She was watching Galt with her patient, level look, and then she looked at me, and what was on her face in that moment was the thing I will carry with me until I can't carry anything. It wasn't soft, it wasn't sentimental. It was just sure. That sure look, that said, this, here, without conditions, without performance, without any of the armor that a woman who's been through what she's been through is entitled to wear for the rest of her life if she wants to. She'd taken the armor off for me. For me. I don't know what I did to deserve that. I paid $40 and I ran a straight house and I didn't crowd her and I stood up in a firelit camp and told a man twice my size that she was free. That's the list. That's all of it. Maybe that's enough to deserve it. Maybe deserving isn't even the right way to think about it. She chose it. She came to it freely and she stays freely. And every morning she makes bread and every evening she sits across from me by the fire. And every night the plane goes on outside, and the wind does what it does, and we are here inside on our own land. And that is the shape of the life I have. I go in most mornings now, and I pour coffee, and I set her cup on the shelf next to the crockery jar and the smooth gray stone, the one that had been in the creek a long time and been made better by it. And she takes it without saying thank you because we're past that, past the politeness of people who don't know each other, deep into the territory of people who do. The left boot first, every morning, and then I go in.